We come together today with heavy-laden hearts, and yet with a joy deep inside which comes from the communion which happens in this place. This is a time for remembering, and we do remember those who have gone before us and made the way. We remember those who have given courage and devotion, who have cleared the path upon which we now trod. And as we give honor and celebrate this grand heritage, we realize that we need to come together. We need one another when we are in trouble and afraid. We need one another when we are in despair, in temptation, and need to be recalled to our best selves. We need one another when we would accomplish some great purpose and cannot do it alone. We need one another in the hour of success when we look for someone to share our triumphs. We need one another in the hour of defeat when with encouragement we might endure and stand again. We need one another when we come to die and would have gentle hands prepare us for the journey. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us.
So today we have a very special story about remembering, and it's called The Lotus Seed. My grandmother saw the emperor cry the day he lost his golden dragon throne. She wanted something to remember him by, so she snuck down to the silent palace near the river of perfumes and plucked a seed from a lotus pod that rattled in the imperial garden. She hid the seed in a special place under the family altar, wrapped in a piece of silk from the dye that she wore that day. Whenever she felt sad or lonely, she took out the seed and thought of the brave young emperor. And when she married a young man chosen by her parents, she carried the seed inside her pocket for good luck, long life, and many children. And when her husband marched off to war, she raised her children by herself. One day, bombs fell all around, and soldiers clamored door to door. She took the time to grab the seed, but she left her mother of pearl hair combs lying on the floor. One terrible day, her family scrambled into a crowded boat and set out on a stormy sea. Ba watched the mountains and the waving palms slowly fade away, and she held the seed in her shaking fingers and silently said goodbye. She arrived in a strange new land with blinking lights and speeding cars and towering buildings that scraped the sky and language she didn't understand. She worked many years, day and night, and so did her children and her sisters and her cousins, all living together in one big house. Last summer, my little brother found her special seed and asked questions again and again. He had never seen a lotus bloom, or an emperor, or a golden eagle throne. Do you know what he did? One night, he stole the seed from beneath the family altar, and he planted it in a pool of mud somewhere near Ba's onion patch. How do you think Ba felt? Sad, yeah. Ba cried and cried when she found out the seed was gone. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep, and my silly brother, he forgot what spot of earth held the seed. Then, one day in spring, the grandmother shouted. We all ran to the garden and saw a beautiful pink lotus unfurling its petals, so creamy and soft. It is the flower of life and hope, my grandmother said. No matter how ugly the mud or how long the seed lies dormant, the bloom will be beautiful. It is the flower of my country. When the lotus blossom faded and turned into a pod, Ba gave each of them one to her grandchildren. She gave each of them a seed to remember her by, and she kept one for herself to remember the emperor by. I wrapped my seed in a piece of silk and hid it in a secret place. Someday I will plant it and give the seeds to my own children and tell them about the day my grandmother saw the emperor cry.
This is Memorial Day weekend, a time to remember. And we do remember all our history, our past here at Live Oak, and even our community, and even our nation, and even our world. And when we are confronted with unimaginable tragedy, our memories can be a refuge for us to remember all that was good and right in the world and what is good and right still in the world. Several of the ministers in this area are sharing this poem, which is a prayer from John O'Donohue, and I would like to join them in offering these words to you. When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you becomes fragile, and your thoughts make your eyes unsure. And some dead echo drags your voice down where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss. And though this loss has wounded others too, no one knows what has been taken from you when the silence of absence deepens. Flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid and undone. There are days when you wake up happy again inside the fullness of life until the moment breaks and you are thrown back over the black tide of loss. Days when you have your heart back, you are able to function well until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly with no warning, you are ambushed by grief. It becomes hard to trust yourself. And all you can depend on now is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself. More than you know, it knows its way and will find the right time to pull and pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually, you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed, and when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. May these words enter our hearts and souls now and always. Amen. We come to this time in our church calendar to take time to pause and to reflect upon and honor that which has transpired in our collective past, our recognition and the honor of the people we have known and experienced, the events that have taken place among us here and around the world. Today is the beginning of Memorial Week in America, a time of remembering. People all over the country will take this day or this week for commemorating the past and the people who have gone on before. This is Memorial Day. Remembering. And as we look backward over these years together, we also necessarily view where we are in the present. And we make comparisons, where we were then and where we are now. And now, with the joyous calling of a new minister here at Live Oak, the Reverend Tamara Suzuki, we are located at a magnificent milestone in the history of this religious community. And over these past, as we were making preparations for the coming of a new minister, we have intensely delved into questions about who we are and where we are, where we have been and where we want to go. And we know that these questions are best answered by asking who and what it is that we have been. And so it is that along the way, we are constantly in the process of remembering. Look around this place with these people on this day and ask, what is it that we have been all about here in this congregation? Each year at this time, over the years of my ministry, I have studied this idea of remembering, of going back, and most religions are based on something that happened in the past. And the coming together of the people in worship is the coming together of the remembering of that past, about the beginning of the world, of the universe, the beginning of our religious way, the beginning of my personal transformation into what I am today. This theme of remembering was, in fact, the subject of the candidating sermon that I gave in my first ministry back in Seattle in 1990. In those days, I asked the tiny congregation that I was about to serve as their minister, why were they calling me? What was I supposed to do at this place? And among the many responses that I got was that I was there to help them remember who they are and what they are and where they're going. And that word remembering, and that word remember, is actually spelled R-E-MEMBER. I was there to remember that congregation, to bring together the members of that congregation, some of who had drifted away over the years since the congregation's founding, and including a golden age of the congregation, after which it began to fall apart and became dismembered. And I was there to remember the place. And so that's still the theme of what I want to say today. I'd like to think about remembering this congregation. And over these past 2 years that I have had the privilege to serve you as your minister, I've always thought about this. I've thought about remembering. And today I'd like to add another flavor to that, and that is to remember the future. How is it that remembering can happen in the future? How can the identity of this community of faith be determined in the future? Well, that's exactly where we are right now. We're remembering in the future. And it's something like that movie, Back to the Future. How can you go back to the future? Well, in Hollywood, you do that with a travel time machine. You can even do it more than once, as the 2 or 3 sequels to that movie shows. But without the technological benefits of Hollywood, how do we remember the future? It's done with an even more miraculous tool than Hollywood possesses. It's done with our imagination. Look at this. 10 years from now, what will this place be like? What will this room be like 10 years from now? Who will be sitting in this room 10 years from now? Who will be the children that will be part of our religious exploration program 10 years from now? Who will be the leadership of this church 10 years from now? Who will be present, who is now present in this congregation, and who will be absent from this congregation 10 years from now? As we imagine this, can we separate that imagining from what we are wishing for this congregation for the next 10 years? It's a difference between saying, oh, I wish such and such would happen around here, and saying such and such will happen entirely according to the pathway upon which we are now walking. It's not a matter of wishcraft, as Samantha used to say. It's a matter of willful behavior on the part of the congregation and willful activity as we walk along this pathway into the future. I hope that you all have been able to tune in to this amazing TV show called Cosmos, a time-space odyssey with Neil deGrasse Tyson. If you haven't seen it, do. And you can actually see it online in case you miss any of it. And last week's episode was called The Immortals. Immortals are those who live on throughout the ages. And in the episode, he spoke about humankind's age-old quest for immortality, of living on, and that this body is only a part of how it is that we live in the world and continue to live, even when this body disintegrates. He begins with stories from 5,000 years ago in a place called Uruk, which we now call Iraq. And the civilization there was one in which the art of writing began. And these people left proof of their existence in what they wrote down, and which now speaks to us across the ages. In that sense, they are immortal, because they still live within and among us. From that part of the world, sometimes called Mesopotamia, comes another written document called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was the original hero's journey. It is the story of Gilgamesh, who left home on a quest to vanquish time. For Gilgamesh was searching for immortality. And among other things in the story, we hear of a worldwide flood that took place, including the stories of the person building an ark to save humanity and all of the animals. And all of these stories come 1,000 years before Noah retold the story in the book of Genesis, and 5,000 years before the current blockbuster movie called Noah with Russell Crowe. When we read these 5,000-year-old stories, we are hearing the voices of the immortals, of those voices from the human beings who will never die, a form of immortality sent from one civilization across the millennia to the next civilization. And after telling these remarkable stories about how it is that humankind lives on, even when their bodies deteriorate, he talks about another important feature about humanity, which is its genetic code, which is also a voice, which in this case is billions of years old. Billions of years it took to create that DNA, which is the code for life as we know it. And he does a remarkable thing with that to say, in this way, we are immortal. In 1963, when I was a sophomore at Clyde High School in Clyde, Ohio, my science class required that I enter the annual science fair. And in fact, I had presented science fair projects for a long time, and I always enjoyed them. The name of my project was Memories, the Way We Were. And in it, I put forth a theory of science and evolution, which I propose to resurrect this morning for your benefit. So you are about to hear a groundbreaking scientific and philosophical proposition, or something like that. What I'm doing this morning follows in the honorable liberal tradition of building one's own theology, something our religious way encourages, and some of you were in our class, which only recently ended. We don't simply buy into the theologies of others. We think about things and come up with our own. And so here is my own theology written. But I have to begin by inserting a confession here. Even though this is my theory, I actually borrowed it from an idea of a man that I knew in Clyde named John Wanowski, who was a locomotive engineer on the Nickel Plate Railroad there. And he spent his days driving these huge trains all around northern Ohio. And I must say that that was the beginning of my eternal fascination with trains. And now I do model trains, but in those days I was going to grow up and be an engineer on a locomotive. So here is the abstract of what John came up with and which I am modifying today. Memory is a biological function of all living things, which is the force of evolution and of life itself. The ability to remember and memorize biological processes is, according to the theory, what makes life as we know it. Memory is the prime mover, the energy of life, the true definition of that elusive concept known as intelligent design. It's also a new definition for that. Indeed, in most ways, when we think of memory, we might say that memory is God. Wow, a new and improved definition of God. How bold, how audacious, how sophomoric. I was a sophomore at the time, by the way. And here's how John explained the thing. Eons ago, before life began, the world was full of non-organic matter just hanging around everywhere. And so there were rocks and waters and fiery lava and stuff like that. Nothing breathed and everything was lifeless. Then one day, somewhere along the coast of the vast oceans, some sort of primordial, non-living ooze was hanging on a rock. And the waves came in and onto it relentlessly. And then the miracle happened. In some mysterious and completely inexplicable way, the ooze began to organize its existence in the midst of the unremitting pounding of the waves. Yes, this is a mystery, and I must declare that my theory, like all the other ones, including what Neil talked about in his show, and which speak of the beginnings of life, all of these have a mystery at the core. No one knows exactly how all this began, and I believe that no one can possibly know. But like the axioms in mathematics, which cannot be proven, you've got to begin somewhere, and that's what I'm doing now. As the early proto-life continued its evolutionary processes, its ability to remember improved. And soon it began to anticipate the next wave. And then it began to prepare for it, perhaps to defend itself. This moment of what we usually call life was, according to my theory, entirely propelled by that ability to remember. What happened before, the way we were, is completely determined by what would happen next. And on it all proceeded. Sometimes what is expected and predicted to happen next doesn't happen, or happens in a different way, and the emerging life form adapts, remembering all along, and this is evolution. And as that ongoing adaptation continues, the organism becomes more and more complex until today, in this moment, we are experiencing this sermon being babbled out by this guy who is obviously nuts. But this beautiful gathering of people here today, in every single part of this moment, is completely and irretrievably dependent on the way we were, the result of all that has happened in all that we remember that was. I am hoping that you can find a relevancy to all of this, to our situation here at Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. We too know that there is much at stake as we seek to remember our future as a congregation. And just as in the situation in our nation and in the world, in our communities, we can see some fairly predictable things about our future. I can see, for instance, that in the future of this place, we will begin to think more and more about how it is that we relate to the larger community of Goleta and Santa Barbara and Southern California. And I'm not talking about numbers of people or of dollars. I'm talking about remembering our historic place as the conscience of the society. Historically, the church has been proclaimed conscience of the culture. It's interesting to note that for many years and decades, in fact, the Unitarians and especially the Universalists were the conscience, were the social conscience of the Christian church in America. We were often the ones who were on the cutting edge of what was termed to be the social gospel. That is, the implementation of the intrapersonal and social implications of the teaching of Jesus. Monumental moral issues like the abolition of slavery, the enfranchisement of women, the creation of unions, these were the areas which we have said required some kind of action by the church, some kind of participation in making these things happen in the culture. And in fact, the Unitarians and Universalists were part of that movement. Interestingly, for our own day is the fact that the social gospel places much less emphasis on the theology of Christianity, including the significance and centrality of personal salvation, and more on the activity of the church among itself and in the larger world. So that at the turn of the 20th century, we were asking, what does the love of God inspire us to do in the world? That was the almighty question. It was the basis for the social gospel. And the gospel message in those days, and I believe is still today, comes from Matthew 25, where the specifics of the godly life are clearly and undeniably set forth. When you do these things, he said, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and imprisoned, giving drink to those who thirst, when you do these things to the very least of the society, the down and out, the despised, the wounded ones, then you are actually and directly serving God itself. Gandhi once said that for millions of people in the world, God comes to them as a piece of bread. We become the conscience in times like these because we remind the world of what is right and just. And sometimes in our reminding, or maybe I can say our remembering, we must take a stand which is unpopular and even puts us at risk. The truth is that it seems to be an essential element in the course of genuine ministry. But it is also the grand reward of ministry. It is an important element of who we are and who we claim to be. And this kind of ministry to the world ends up ministering to us and fulfilling us as human beings. We become more whole, more true to our nature. And as the momentum increases, just like those relentless waves on that primordial matter, those billions and billions of years ago, as we become more true to our nature and as the momentum increases, we become empowered to take our rightful place as a prophetic voice of the world, the voice of conscience. And I personally believe that eventually, and sometimes this process takes a long time, takes eons perhaps in the evolutionary course of things, but eventually the people begin to listen because what we're saying is about justice. And it is certainly no surprise that in times of true ministry, in those times in which the history of this congregation, in which this true ministry is taking place and was taking place, we also found ourselves growing, enlarging ourselves in numbers and in the fulfillment of our essential mission. There is even a life-giving element of communion, which happens at no other time, when the people come together with purpose and meaning in order to accomplish their collective mission. This church is alive, it is active, and it is vibrant. It is growing, and that means it is changing, enlarging itself in numbers and in the fulfillment of its essential mission. And its life and its breath is positively invigorating. This is true excitement, because this is true minister. And now, as we reach out and gather together the memories of the way we were, when we gather the memories of what we have been and where we have gone and what we have done, we bring those memories forward into this present moment, even as we remember the future. And this is true because this is true ministry. Amen.